And Paul, it's great to be with you. I'll just say a few more words by way of introduction before we get into our conversation. So you've Dr. Paul Atkins, a background as a social and organisational psychologist and one of the co-founders of ProSocial World, and we'll find out a bit more about that later on, but it's a not-for-profit organisation that seeks to catalyse positive cultural change by recognising our interconnectedness and continuously improving the relationships we have with ourselves, each other, and the planet. And in your previous life, Paul, an associate professor and leading expert in the public sector leadership development at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU in Canberra, before becoming a senior research fellow with the Institute for Positive Psychology and Education at the Australian Catholic University. But you've shaped leadership skills and wellbeing of thousands of public sector managers throughout postgraduate teaching and executive education programs, with a particular emphasis on mindfulness and acceptance commitment therapy. Lead author of the best-selling book, ProSocial, using evolutionary science to build productive, equitable, and collaborative groups. So today we're going to be talking about explore why a more pro-social approach to life matters and what practical steps we can take to build a pro-social world. So, Paul, can you just, before we get underway with some of the nitty-gritty, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey from psychology to academia to now working in the not-for-profit sector?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. It's lovely to be talking with you again. Craig and I, we met, I think, teaching mindfulness at the Australian National University. I'm pretty sure. Might have been on a retreat before that, but I certainly remember really enjoying working with you to bring mindfulness training to the ANU. So yeah, I started out as did my first degrees in science and psychology, and then I did a PhD actually looking at neural networks and long-term memory. So I was really interested in cognitive science and philosophy and artificial intelligence and so on, and was playing around with some of the earliest versions of the things, those machines that are now either helping or blighting our existence today. But I worked in cognitive science for a while, but then I really wanted to do something a bit more pragmatic, and I'd always been really attracted to helping to enhance human relationships, basically. I think that probably goes back to my parents' divorce and early efforts to try to bring my own parents back together, but I've basically been trying to do that all my life, is to create more harmony and effective communication. So from my PhD, I went to University of New South Wales and then down to ANU and then to the Australian Catholic University, as you said. And I moved more into social and organisational psychology, working with people, teaching communication skills and conflict resolution and organisational behaviour and leadership in particular, which was lovely. And then I had the joyous opportunity, I met David Sloan Wilson. He had been working with, David Sloan Wilson is an evolutionary biologist who is co-founder of ProSocial World with me, and along with Jeff Janung, our general manager. And David had already met Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winning economist. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009, first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And he'd started to generalize her core design principles to groups of all sorts. And then I was introduced to David at an acceptance and commitment therapy conference, and the rest is history. We decided to write a book together with David and also Steve Hayes, the inventor of acceptance and commitment therapy, and that became the ProSocial book. And from that, we started our not-for-profit called ProSocial World, which is primarily about building capability. It's really about two things. It's about building capability and facilitators, and also developing I guess, more pro-social worldviews, if you like, the alternatives to our dominant capitalist kind of greed is good and everybody's separate and individual. And we're trying to tell a story of how nature just doesn't work that way, that we're deeply interconnected and, interreliant.
So it's been quite a sort of a weaving sort of journey you've taken, but clearly pro-social sort of aspects have really drawn you. And it might be a term that a lot of our audience are already familiar with, but I suspect there'd be a lot of people who would not be very familiar with the term. So what does it mean to be pro-social? Is it just about how we think, or is it about behaviors as well?
Yeah, thank you. So in social psychology, it's often defined as voluntary behavior intended to benefit others. So that's important. The benefit others bit is pretty obvious. That's the pro-social aspect, but it is voluntary behavior. So if you do something pro-social, like if you help someone just because you have to, because there's a rule or something, or because you're trying to be socially approved of, then that's not really what we're thinking of. What we're thinking of is something that's more like where there's a genuine intent to be of help to one another or help to others other than oneself. It doesn't necessarily have to be at cost to oneself. It could be that it's mutually beneficial to help someone, but sometimes it is. And human beings human beings will sacrifice their lives for something they believe in for the good of a greater group, potentially. So that's it. And I think the other part of what you asked there is really important, that it's about not just the agreements that we have with one another and the ways that we work together to share power, to make sure that all voices are heard and so forth, but it's also about how we show up internally, what's going on in our inner behavior, if we like. Are we coming from a place of ego? Are we coming from a place of defensiveness? Are we coming from a place of trying to project ourselves in some particular way? And those things are fine as long as they don't get in the way of actually being of help to one another.
So could you be working in a career, helping career, could be in the health sector, for example. So you're doing the same job, but one person could be working in a very pro-social way, that is, the heart's in it, real care and compassion for others. Somebody else could be doing outwardly the same behaviors, doing the procedures, helping, but the heart's not really in it. They're just doing it because that's what the job dictates, and doing a roster and going to go home, get a day's pay, etc. So is it really comes down to the motivation from what you're saying, that sort of voluntary, that the open-heartedness with which one does something?
Absolutely. Like, I can actually be a little bit vulnerable here. I look at my own life trajectory, and I think I've been studying pro-sociality and nonviolent communication pretty much my whole career in one form or another. But a lot of early on was about, making it as an academic, being seen, carving out new territories and publishing papers and all that sort of stuff. Actually thinking about making the world a better place is something that's really come to me much more in my 40s and 50s than it did when I was younger. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I think there's a really interesting difference between being nice and being kind. Being nice is really about being pro-social for the reasons of approval of others, and that can be a major motivator for many people. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I think that it's a jumping off point for a genuine desire to be helpful. But yeah, we do need to look at what's our intent. Are we really, I often think about it in terms of when we make decisions moment to moment? Are we basically thinking what's in it for me or what's in it for me and us? We don't want to go the other way too. We don't want to go, like be a doormat. It's about integration of our own interests and the interests of the greater whole.
Is being pro-social just how we're wired at birth? Some people are maybe genetically disposed to it, or just something in early upbringing, and so some people have it kind of in their nature, or is it something that can be very much nurtured or taught as well, even into later life?
Well, I wouldn't be doing what I was doing unless I thought it could be nurtured and taught. So I really hope so. There is a heritable component for something like 30 to 50% in twin studies that can be attributed of prosociality that can be attributed to a genetic aspect. But I think that so there's probably two things to say. One is it definitely can be taught. I mean, we can change context to make people be much more pro-social as well. But the other thing to say is that we're inherently pro-social. And of course, that doesn't mean we're pro-social all the time. In some contexts, when we're afraid, when we're under threat, when we're competing for resources, we can act deeply antisocially, as we can see from the wars that are going on around the world. But there's been studies of toddlers, for example, before they can even talk. So before they're able to take any instruction from anybody, toddlers will spontaneously help somebody who drops something on the floor, and a toddler will crawl over and give that thing back to the person. We are wired to be pro-social. And I was actually reviewing some evidence just the other day about how when people play these public good games, they have in economics, they have measures of how pro-social people are, and they should I share with you just a little bit about what a public goods game is? And so a public good game is where they get a group of people and they give them all, say, $100 or something, and then they say you've got a choice of how you can donate some portion of that to a common pool. And the nice thing is that the common pool will be multiplied by some factor. Let's say it's doubled or something, and then we'll give back in equal proportion to everybody from the common pool. So you choose how much you donate, but you get back in equal proportion from the increased amount. And there's been studies done of that all around the world in literally dozens of different cultures. And across cultures, the most recent meta-analysis from 2022 suggests that across cultures, people donate about a third of what they have to this common pool at risk of getting nothing back. I mean, there's a big incentive there to free ride and not donate anything to the common pool, but just take from it. But people don't do that. They don't give 100%, but they also don't give zero. And so I think there's a very strong pro-social kind of nature to humanity. We are inherently pro-social as a baseline.
If it is natural for us to be pro-social, then does it become second nature to be antisocial? Is that the thing we kind of learn or get enculturated to, is in environments where we can be less compassionate, less caring? If we're in an environment like that, if we're bombarded by messages like that, so is the other thing kind of becomes second nature or habitual to us to be antisocial?
Well, I mean, there's genetic elements to that too. We get amygdala hijack. We get a sort of fight-flight response. There's aspects of being a separate organism that we're inherently self-protective. So I'm not trying to say that all antisociality is learned, but in an environment where there's enough, where there's not scarcity and there's some degree of safety, we tend toward prosociality. I think that antisociality is, I mean, there's really good evidence that a lot of it has to do with upbringing and particular models of how people relate to one another, but it's also to do with circumstances, the degree of safety, the kinds of cultural norms that are in place for helping one another. I mean, I guess we'll get onto this in a way, but this is where I see this whole dominant ideology of economics and capitalism is so damaging, in that it's basically establishing a norm of antisociality, a norm of competitiveness and individuality and separateness, which we're now reaping the harvest of that relative to more traditional cultures and indigenous cultures.
So how does one train people or help to foster that prosociality in others? What sort of, to bring about that within the individual or within groups? So what would a pro-social course look like? How would increase it?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that that's pretty much what we try to do. So maybe I should just tell you a little bit about what's in the course. We actually start with communication skills, and in particular listening, reflective listening. If there's one single thing that I think enhances, well, there's probably two things that enhance prosociality the most. One is being able to really listen to somebody, and listen not just for kind of the surface of what they're saying, but listening for their feelings and what matters to them. What are their values? What are their goals? And then if you can play that back, it builds trust, it builds attunement, it builds connection. So that's one thing. The other thing is values clarity. When people are clear about what really matters to them at their heart, they're often pro-social. I mean, that's a natural extension of the fact that we are inherently pro-social in many ways. And so working on shared purpose and shared identity is a huge thing for creating connection within groups. Shared identity can be a double-edged sword, of course, because you can have a great identity that, I'm what am I now? I'm a Manly Warringah supporter in rugby league, but I don't like you AFL players down in the Melbourne Storm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but so those are a couple of things. I think mindfulness training is also something that's really critical, as you well know, and I've even heard you teach this, that mindfulness training can quiet the default mode network and create enough space for us to be present to others and to start to make that shift from me to we.
Could you expand on that, about how mindfulness helps that shift from me to we? Can you nuance that a little bit more? How that sort of helps to bridge those that sort of separation? Because a lot of people think of mindfulness as being quite a self-centered sort of practice. Yeah. Sometimes people say things along the lines, or just sitting down thinking about yourself, and but it's not quite like that. So how does mindfulness help to bridge that gap?
Well, from a psychological perspective, I think it's about, as I said, slowing down enough to sort of maybe create a little space around the endless chatter that's usually is, it is self-focused. We're often thinking, what do I want next? What am I going to do? How do I get it? Am I getting enough, etc., etc.? So we're often thinking in a very sort of instrumental, utilitarian kind of way. And so mindfulness can create enough spaciousness. It can also create a sense of soothing, which activates our kind of parasympathetic nervous system and allows us to get out of fight flight kind of responding. I think it can also help us to connect with what really matters to us and to really become aware of what's most important in this moment. And I mean, that's what acceptance and commitment therapy, which is another part of pro-social acceptance and commitment training, is really mindfulness plus explicit values work around, what matters most to you and what matters most to us as a collective. And so, yeah, dropping out of that kind of reactivity mode, that default mode network chatter, and into a place of spaciousness. We often start in our pro-social courses, we often start with a moment of mindfulness, and it's not, and then we might say something like, give us one word about how you're arriving and one word about your intention. And that's the two wings there of what's happening now, how am I present, and what matters to me in terms of creating something in the world. And that's what matters to me is not a selfish what matters to me. It's about, I'm here as a whole organism showing up. What contribution can I make? It might be that, Yeah.
It seems that self-awareness is a very important part of that, to bring awareness to oneself, one's
Definitely.
reactions. Does that help to give a little bit of discernment, in the moment of reacting or making decisions? Does that self-awareness help us to have a bit more discernment about what values we're actually going to choose rather than just being on automatic pilot?
Yes, definitely. And also, I think another piece of that is noticing when we're trying to project or protect a particular identity or, a particular sense of ourselves. For me, at least, that's when I'm in conflict, it's almost always, if I ask myself, what am I trying to project or protect? There'll be something there. It might be my sense of being right. It might be my sense of, being competent or whatever. But there's something there that I'm trying to hold on to. This is me, and I don't want you to threaten me, my psychological me, what some people call ego.
Yeah. You've done a lot of work with leadership training over the years, and it strikes me that aligning pro-sociality with the sort of imperatives of KPIs and competitive sort of environments and economically and for some in a very adversarial kind of environment, especially in professions like law and so on, as they can often be. How do you align pro-social values with those sorts of other imperatives that seem to be pulling in the other direction?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, fortunately, the business world's kind of catching up with an awareness of pro-sociality. I actually did a workshop just last week with a big law firm, and it's an absolutely beautiful team that really genuinely wants to create more of a shared power, engaging environment. And so that was a delight to work in that context. I must admit, I'm old enough and I don't need work so much anymore that I don't work with groups that are trying to put a sort of pro-social veneer over the top of a extractivist organization. I mean, there are groups like that around for sure, but they're dinosaurs.
Pro-social washing.
Yeah, pro-social washing, exactly. I think they're genuinely dinosaurs in terms of, young people just don't want to work in teams like that. They want to work in places where they can believe in something and where they get a sense of belonging, especially in the face of all the other stresses that are in society.
Is there evidence that pro-sociality is good for you? I mean, you kind of get a sense it'd be good for others if you're helping them and so on. But I suppose part of what's behind that question is that people very often say, I just feel good when I help somebody else, or
Mm.
it just helped with stress, or it gave me a lift, and so on. Is there evidence to show that it's good for us psychologically, physically?
All of the above, yeah. Really strong evidence, actually, and repeated, meta-analyses and so on, showing positive associations with stress, with measures of happiness, with a sense of meaning, with reducing loneliness, but also with, as you said, the physiological measures, lower blood pressure, better immunity, longer lifespan, lower mortality. It literally, some of the effect sizes are not huge in some spaces, but they're consistent. And in other areas, I mean, in terms of sort of psychological effects, I think there's really solid evidence that helping people benefits us as well. Actually, I really like in this space the listeners might be interested in an approach called self-determination theory, which essentially says that we have three basic psychological needs. We all need to belong. We all need to have agency in the world, or self-efficacy, that we can get things done. And we all need to be self-determining in the sense that we're, could freely endorse our actions as freely chosen, as voluntary. And when you help people, it helps all of those things. You're freely choosing to do it. You've got a sense of belonging, and you've got a sense of agency. You're actually the one who's being of use, So there's really strong connections there between helping people and well-being.
Yeah, I suspect it's quite a challenging area to research in some ways, and perhaps one of the things that some researchers would question is that if the studies are just done hypothetically, giving people hypothetical situations, or just lab-based, that they may not really reflect what happens in the real world.
Mm.
But seeing what happens in the real world in terms of behavior when there are so many confounding factors must be quite challenging sometimes. Is it a difficult area of research to do, or at least to do well?
It is if you go for things like randomized controlled trials and things like that. If you hold that up as the only standard of research, then yeah, that can be sometimes hard to pull off, and can be not very sort of profitable, because you can control for a host of things that are actually helpful in the context. I think helping one another it's very context dependent. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of problems with causality, like does prosociality cause well-being, or is it the reverse, or something like that? There's all sorts of problems with the complexity of the systems that we study. That you can't have a control group, for instance, in most situations. But I guess there's abundant. The things I've said so far, there's plenty of evidence for everything I've said so far. And so people do manage to pull it off. And increasingly for me, I must say, I'm just going on the evidence that I see before my own eyes of working with people and being able to hear them deeply and to hear what they care about, and then to create environments where those needs are met across the entire group or entire team. And we've got some tremendous case studies as well, which I could, talk to you about, of making a real difference when you adopt this sort of approach.
What, working with organizations or communities and introducing something, and see what the patterns of communication and helping behaviors are like, how they change.
Yeah. Do you want me to give you an example or two?
Sure.
So one of the examples I like the most, it was kind of an early one, but it's in the healthcare context. And I was thinking about this before the call, given your background. Jim Lemon paediatric psychologist working in the National Health Service in the UK, was working with children and with chronic, life-threatening illnesses, and wanted a way of, well, first of all, he wanted a way of sort of engaging the family and the child, the patient, in conversation, and started to use some of our methods in that context, and discovered that, one of the tools that we use, which is called the ACT Matrix tool, it's basically a tool that allows you to map what you care about, but also what you're afraid of, and what those two aspects, love and fear, are making you do. So he first of all used that with some of the children that he was working with, and got really good results. For example, with one child who wasn't taking the medication that they needed to stay alive, he found out that through using this process, that part of that was, it wasn't about being resistant or anything, it was about, this was the one area of control that the child felt they still had over their lives, was be able to choose whether or not to take the medication. And so, then he's able to work with their actual needs. But with our other methods of creating ways of making decisions together, of finding shared purpose, of tracking one another's behaviour and getting feedback, these are all kind of principles built into our approach, which I now think you asked me about earlier, and I didn't finish telling you what else is in our course, but we can come back to that. With all those principles, he started to, foster stronger relationships between the child and the families. And then other professionals in the healthcare sector that were working with this child saw that the good things were happening there. And then they wanted to start using pro-social methods to create more positive relationships across disciplinary specialties inside the hospital that were all working. So, a shared purpose of helping this person. And that was enormously effective. I mean, that's sort of work that we have hierarchies to organise cooperation, but hierarchies aren't going to work for a cross-disciplinary medical team or for a family trying to relate to their child. That it's just not a good mechanism to have power by authority. We need to have shared power, ways of collaborating, and that's what we're trying to create. Yeah. Another example in a community context, which we write about in our book, so again, a fairly old example, but a very good one, was the work done by Hannah Boukary and Beate Ebert and Tom Zabo and others in Sierra Leone. One of the Ebola outbreaks there, the World Health Organization approach was sort of top-down, put everyone in body bags, try and protect people from getting infected. But that just completely cut across the cultural traditions of the area. And, people weren't doing that. Part of the cultural tradition was to wash the dead and to kiss the dead and so forth. And they were still doing that, and infection rates were really high. And, you can go in and you can adopt a coercive top-down approach to that, and sort of force people not to do that. But what those folks did with ProSocial was have a conversation and see if they could come up with other ways where they could meet both the needs of, stopping. I mean, obviously to these people, stopping infection is important, but also caring for their loved ones and honouring their traditions is important. So how do we do both? And they came up with a way of using a banana trunk as a kind of proxy for the body, and they'd wash the banana trunk and dress the banana trunk and then bury it alongside the body. And that was culturally appropriate and resolved the issue. So, we can, it's this kind of win-win mentality, I guess.
This sort of shared, sort of working through the problem. And just one thing I wanted to touch on, we're going to be taking some questions in a couple of minutes, but we sort of live in a world where social media and technology to some extent has sort of become very dominant forces. And there are obviously examples where social media can play a very positive influence in situations in people's lives, but more commonly it's used in a way that sort of feeds a kind of a me focus, or feeds division, polarization, and so on. And there's research on that as well. Do these kinds of things provide particular challenges or opportunities for building a more pro-social world?
As a parent of what were previously teenage girls, I'm not a huge fan of most forms of social media. I mean, there's abundant evidence, research from within, for example, Facebook's own labs, showing that they're fueling division, conflict, separation, even genocide. In the case of Myanmar, there's a very disturbing case there of how Facebook's algorithms amplified hate speech and calls for violence against the Rohingya and so forth, simply because those things get clicks, you know. So Facebook's made a number of choices quite consciously, even in the face of evidence, to behave in a particular way, which is net damaging for humanity. However, you can point to other social networks, and even within Facebook during the time of COVID, people used Facebook to organise mutual aid networks, and you know, really positive things can happen on Facebook. You can meet people from long ago, but the design is not to prioritise pro-sociality and connection. The design is to prioritise money, and they get that through what they call engagement, through clicks. So they want you to keep. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard a story that there was a very early on in Facebook's development, the co-founder with Mark Zuckerberg said, "Hey, why don't we, you know, encourage people to meet up in real life?" And you know, I probably shouldn't say this in public because I don't know if it's true, but this is what I heard, was that Mark Zuckerberg said, no, if they do that, then they're going off our platform. So, you know, it's all about the platform. So now, having said that, we've worked with a group called the Terran Collective to build the core design principles, which I haven't really talked about yet, but a lot of our model is based on the work of Elinor Ostrom, as I mentioned earlier, who won the Nobel Prize for essentially arguing that that people aren't inherently selfish. You know, the economic orthodoxy is that if you have a bunch of people trying to share a resource, they'll take as much as they can until it's all gone. And she showed that if people can communicate with one another and adopt some basic principles like equity and inclusive decision-making and transparency of behaviour and so forth, that actually they could cooperate for thousands of years and sustainably manage resources. I mean, she did work with Indigenous groups that have been doing exactly that, and groups that have been managing water supplies in Valencia, for example, in Spain for more than 1,000 years and still do. And so there are definitely ways of doing this. And we've tried to work with the Terran Collective and a social network called Hilo to embed and embody some of those principles.
Yeah,
you can design that way.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think we'll continue the conversation, but through some of the questions that are coming in. So Kevin's been keeping an eye on that. So Kevin, over to you. What questions have our audience got for Paul today?
Awesome. Thanks for the conversation, Paul and Craig. It's been really good. We've got a few questions coming in. So just as a note, I'll do my best to get to all of them. Hopefully we can. But if we don't get to all of them, you know, just sort of have to apologize. I'll try to do them according to themes and what we've been talking about a little bit as well. But Paul, maybe on this this topic of you know, using social media and maybe some of the downsides that's come about from this, Sarah Strohmeyer actually asked a question. She basically says, "Thanks, Paul, for a really interesting chat." And she asked, "Well, if you're working in industry, have you come across people that maybe that don't believe in pro-sociality or they don't want to help people? And how do you actually manage that? And are there some people that maybe try to leverage or take advantage of you or the pro-social program? And how does one actually manage that? You know, maybe just putting on like a face of pro-sociality or something. So yeah, just interested to hear your thoughts on
that. So to take, it's a great question. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. I'll take the second one first. It immediately made me think of a situation where I had a team of, should I say, of surgeons actually working with one another, and they I was teaching them active listening and more pro-social communication techniques. Unbeknownst to me, one of the members of the team was collecting data for basically going to bring, and so he was in the room in a way that had nothing to do with learning to communicate more effectively or enhance the team. It was actually about covert operations, basically. That experience, I actually feel a little bit tearful right now, because it was like, I felt violated, if I can say that. It felt like I'd been, the very heart of what I was trying to do had been ripped out, and it was so distressing and disturbing. There was I used to ride home from work along the lakefront at the ANU, and I remember just picking up the phone at one point and getting just bawled out by the person who'd been taken advantage of in this, the case was being brought against by the side of the lake as I was riding home. And anyway, I remembered, like, for years after that, going past, I was just really distressed. Anyway, but the point is, we have to not be naive about this. There are definitely people who want to take advantage, that have been so hurt, so damaged, that's their modus operandi. And I would go even so far as to say there's probably about 1% of the population that would clinically score on a psychopathy scale that we're probably never going to be able to touch. And maybe we're seeing a few of those folks coming to the top in society now. So it happens, and we have to be careful, which is why I think it's really important that we have the trust building mechanisms in the principles. One key one, or three key ones, are transparency of behaviour, graduated sanctions for misbehaviour, and fast and fair conflict resolution, because it's going to happen. We are inherently pro-social, but we're going to get into conflicts, and we're going to disagree, and we're going to need to realistically deal with that. We can't be naive. People are going to act out of self-interest. In terms of the other one, I think oftentimes when people come to that from a place in business, they sort of say, oh, I don't believe in all this, fluffy stuff was a term that was used recently with me. It's usually coming out of a place of defending themselves. It's usually like, it's either coming out of a place of, I've learned this pattern of, this is what I'm good at, is dog eat dog and so forth. So it's kind of habitual, or it's coming out of a place of fear that if I'm vulnerable, people are going to take advantage of me and I'll be hurt. And so usually I'm working with that in some way or other. I hope that is helpful. It's weird not being able to see you.
Nice. You can talk to us anyway, so that's
yeah.
I think that's good enough. But yes, a really, really great answer. So maybe just shifting it a little bit. There was a question from Kimberly, and she talks about motivations and how we maybe tap into some of our motivations. And her question is you mentioned that your motivation has shifted as you got older, from publishing papers and proving yourself to a more mindful state of societal belonging. And she says, well, she's noticed the same kinds of things. So that actually makes her wonder, do you think this is because of societal expectations that are projected onto younger people of needing to be competitive and their need to prove themselves as worthy, especially among those peers, and obviously maybe people that they're maybe looking for a job with, or they consider superior? So do you think some of that kind of motivation has been sort of pushed onto them by society?
I think so. But I also think, so I mean, that's certainly true in a sense. Like, part of my shift has been, certainly lately, it's been the luxury of being, economically well established enough, and not caring quite so much about getting more jobs and things like that. So certainly that's a luxurious, privileged position to be in, which young people are not. But there's also a developmental trajectory across life in terms of perspective taking. I mean, anyone who's had children knows that they are, pretty despite what I said about being inherently pro-social, and they're also quite self-focused. Actually, it's one of our biggest cognitive achievements to be able to step into the shoes of somebody else and to be able to really genuinely understand and care about what they're caring about. And that takes a lifetime to develop. So if you look at adult developmental frameworks, you'll see that people do tend toward being better at perspective taking, being better at or more interested in creating a legacy and doing things for the good of others. I mean, not everybody, I'm certain you could find many exceptions, but as a general average, we tend toward that as we get older.
Nice, good stuff. And so, yeah, so something that rolls on from that, Joel asked the question, if this is the case, that maybe our values change as we get a little bit older, would you suggest that it's the survival of the most cooperative rather than survival of the fittest? And I'll just add something on here. This is my own question here. So because I'm gonna take the advantage of doing that. And so you did talk about developing and becoming clear on your values and becoming clear on the kind of principles that you hold. So if it is the survival of the most cooperative, how do we develop these values? How do we develop some of these principles? What's maybe some practical tips to do that?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, so definitely Joel's anticipated exactly what's really at the heart of our approach, which is another part of it, which I haven't really talked about so much, is there's two competing schools of evolutionary theory. There's one that's very much sort of focused around, genes, replicating, and individuals. But there's another approach called multi-level selection, which is basically saying it isn't about survival of the fittest individual, it's about survival of the fittest group, which is essentially the most cooperative. And Darwin anticipated this, that there were group-level selection effects that could have happened. That more cooperative groups are more likely to survive, to pass on their practices, and to than less cooperative groups. So there's definitely an element of that. And then to your question about how does one develop this, I mean, that's really our task in ProSocial World. We do it through communication skills, through finding shared purpose and identity, through creating agreements in groups that create contexts that support more pro-social behaviour and less threat, that build trust. So that's essentially what we're trying to do.
Excellent. I think it's time that we'll need to finish. We could continue the conversation for a lot longer, and I suspect a lot of the people on the webinar today will like to find out more about ProSocial World and look into the work you're doing, and some may even want to cooperate or connect or access some of the kinds of resources and training. So we've popped that in the chat as well. So thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you also, Kevin, for doing all the behind the scenes work as well. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Craig. And just as a quick note as well, there's a link to Paul's book in there if you're interested in that, and also there's some links in the chat to sign up for the M3CS newsletter and check out some of the older or some of the other conversations that Craig's been having with some very, very interesting people, and signing up for the M3CS newsletter. And so with that, again, we'll thank Paul, we'll thank Craig. Really, really interesting talk today. And so we'll see you next month for the